It's exhausting being Black. You have probably heard this phrase said by Black folks, young and old. But just how deep and far reaching are the harms of systemic racism, and what do white people and other groups need to do to end this scourge on not only Black people, but on all marginalized groups? It's Friday, and it's been a long week, but we would be remiss if we didn't end this week by talking about what got us here, and that's racism, plain and simple. And I'm here for it, and so are today's guests, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
Unless you have been under a rock, you know that on Tuesday, after nearly 11 hours of deliberation, the jury in the trial of Derek Chauvin for the death of George Floyd returned guilty verdicts on all three of the charges filed against him by the state of Minnesota. Derek Chauvin's bail was revoked, and we watched him be put into handcuffs and escorted out of that Minneapolis courtroom. He is now in a Minneapolis correctional facility awaiting sentencing, which will happen in about 8 weeks. Chauvin is facing up to 75 years in prison for executing George Floyd in broad daylight before a group of innocent bystanders who, by fate, witnessed one of the most heinous uses of force by a police against a citizen. After the verdict was read, advocates and activists all over the country exhaled and celebrated the much anticipated and highly unusual conviction of a white police officer for the murder of an African-American man. The president, the vice president, and community leaders have praised the jury verdict as a giant step on the long road to criminal justice reform and a more equitable society. But many in the Black community are asking, is it really such a big step forward? Here from my leadoff panel is Maria Perry. She is a community activist, pastor, and executive director of Secrets to Truth in St. Paul, Minnesota, just miles from where George Floyd was murdered. Good morning and welcome, Pastor Perry.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. It was so important to me for this show that we talk to someone like you, someone who's been on the ground in Minneapolis at the location where George Floyd was killed, who's been a part of the protest. Tell us what the mood of the city is today.
You know, we're still kind of angry. There has been a little hurt, but there's that trauma. We don't have a lot of trust in the system. We're all trying to heal. But even after that, we are experiencing, the young lady who was just murdered, the 16-year-old young lady that was murdered. So it was Michaela. And, having to, deal with this Minneapolis issue with George Floyd. And now, thinking that we can come to some type of calm. It's not calm. We're still worried. We still have concerns and we're not healing. And how can we heal when we continue to arrive at places such as this, when you have police continuing to hunt and torment the Black bodies and other folks that, are dying at their hands, and we are traumatized by this experience. And this is just one way that they're making it right. But I believe that there's more that they can do behind the justice system. This is not a behavior that we want to continue to get comfortable with. So it's not get comfortable. We still have to be proactive about using our voices and staying connected in community and still bringing awareness to the systemic racism and police brutality as it pertains to Black folks.
Yeah, I want to take you back, Pastor, to that afternoon, that Tuesday afternoon when the verdict was read out and the world found out that Derek Chauvin was, had been found guilty of second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter, knowing that particularly that second-degree murder charge carries a prison sentence up to 40 years. Can you just tell me, what was going through the minds of the crowd? Were people, surprised that the verdict had been delivered on that date? Were they surprised at what the verdict was? Help us understand what people were thinking and saying and doing in that exact moment.
Oh my gosh. What I witnessed was the joy and the smiles, because we didn't have trust. We didn't have trust that this was going to happen, and, to be guilty, all 3 charges. I mean, I saw the smiles, the tears, like I was even screaming. I was crying because we're thinking the boot's been on the ground and we've been moving and pushing. And there's so many other amazing leaders and activists that have been on the front lines of this. And to see the tears run down their face. And even now when I think about it, I want to cry, because we didn't have hope in the system. And to hear that this officer was convicted of all 3 charges, oh my gosh, it was like there's a breakthrough. There is a breakthrough, and we can't forget that experience. And we also know that there's still much work to do. But in that moment that we're talking about, I could see hugs and, again, tears and people coming from all over the place, just gathering. If you didn't know somebody, it didn't even matter. We were gathering and hugging and just sharing that experience and uplifting each other in that space. And even people creating Zoom links to comfort each other and to share that joy of knowing that this officer was convicted of all 3 charges.
You preaching, Pastor.
You couldn't make that up. And I'm thinking this at least, because we've been out on the front line, so we know what this is. But if we can give at least a little hope to the community that has suffered, that worry about their children, that worry about their Black sons and their daughters, if we can give a little hope around that type of justice, then I think that's what happened there. And so to see the families and their babies and our sons, even looking at my sons, I had to call them and say, "Oh, I love you," and where are you and what are you thinking? To do that check-in, to see like, where are you? Where are you at in your being? Like, did you see what happened? Because they weren't resting at night. They were worried about it, and just having anxiety up until that day, that moment, there was a little breath that we could finally just breathe for a second. Even if it was for 5 seconds, we were able to take a breath and say, somebody's hearing us. Our actions that we took to stand, for justice, someone heard us. Yeah. And so that meant a lot. And so to see, again, everybody gather from all over, it was amazing to see. It was amazing to be there. The spirits that were there that were so heavy, but still together, and the smiles and the work of everybody that, again, have, been on the front lines. It's so much respect to them and so much love goes out to them today.
Yeah, that was so beautifully stated. We've seen George Floyd's family stand up under the glare of the cameras and the spotlight and, comport themselves with such poise and sophistication and grace. We got to give them a lot of credit, but we also have to give so much credit to those activists that you just talked about who have been, on the front lines pushing for the arrest of these officers, for the prosecution of these officers, for more serious charges being brought against these officers, and for ultimately the conviction. So, so much, I think, praise, to the activists that have been really driving this change that we're seeing taking place across the nation. I do want to ask you about the sentencing. We know that that's going to happen in about 8 weeks. We know what the maximum sentence opportunities are, and the judge has a lot of discretion. But we also know that Minnesota has sentencing guidelines, and those guidelines for those second and third degree murder charges are about 12 and a half years. There's some aggravating factors that the prosecution wants the judge to consider that could push the sentence above what the guidelines are, so there could be a departure from the guidelines. What do you think the community, what do they feel like is going to be the correct number of years that Derek Chauvin spends behind bars?
He needs to do all 75 of those years and more. So we're looking for him to not 12 years. That's not enough. That's not enough at all. He needs to do all of his time. I'm saying 75 years plus. He needs to do life. in prison. He doesn't need to see another day because George doesn't get to see another day. And his family is forever taunted by this experience. The many times that they share this video and to see them, you know, on their press conferences, to be there and humbled, to have to watch this. Oh my gosh. And his daughter, no, he needs to do all 75 years or plus, if that is a thing. He needs to do life. We're not looking for him to do 12 years. We need to change the laws. And that is the problem. We need to change the laws because they're giving more of our brothers that are doing crime more years than they are with these police officers and white men who are murdering Black folks. Yeah. You know, so he needs to do all of his time.
Well, the good news is the prosecutors have filed 2 documents asking the judge to consider 5 aggravating factors that would allow the judge to sentence Chauvin above the presumptive 12.5 years for the murder charge, for the murder convictions, and the 4 years for the manslaughter. Well, let me ask you about the 3 other officers. This isn't over yet. So we know that in August, those other 3 officers are set to go to trial. There's some people, Pastor, who are talking about hoping that these 3 officers would, you know, run to the prosecutor's office, and the prosecutor's office would consider a plea deal, you know, plea bargain for these officers to spare the family and the community yet another traumatizing, you know, 3-week trial. Do you think that that would be considered justice, you know, with the advocates and activists that you've been working with? You know, how would they feel if there's a plea deal reached with the other 3 officers?
That's not justice. That's not justice. They stood there and they watched their fellow colleague murder a man, broad daylight, and didn't even try to stop him from doing that. They're all as guilty. They're all as guilty, and there shouldn't be no plea. And I don't think that we would sit on that.
This though, Pastor, do you have any concern about having another trial where that 9-year-old has to testify again, that 17-year-old, the 61-year-old, you know, man, and we have to watch that videotape or those multiple videotapes over and over again? Any concern that, you know, that is going to re-traumatize the community?
It is. It's still traumatizing, and we haven't even begun to work on the healing for community. You know, we've all been so active in moving that no one is actually thinking about the wellness of our people. So to actually, you know, go through this whole trial space again, you know, that's just going to add further harm to who we are and to our community. You know, they're not thinking about us at all. You know, they're not even thinking about the families. And so, you know, that is a concern for myself, and I'm sure that it's a concern for other activists in the community as it pertains to healing. There's so much trauma. We're so traumatized, and, you know, not even, you know, thinking of, you know, just that, but, you know, they're spending all this money on troops to come here to protect the city. But what about protecting us? So what plan do they have for our wellness here while we're having to experience the level of trauma that we're dealing with by watching the video, by revisiting the stories, by having to have this experience and then to continue to have these conversations, how draining and how tormenting these conversations are, and just to see it. You know, so it's going to add further harm to what we're already experiencing here in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And again, the whole world. Yeah. You know, everybody's watching. So folks that don't live here are watching. We're all experiencing levels of trauma as it pertains to this case. You know, and we keep experiencing it here in Minnesota, from Philando Castile to George Floyd, you know, Jamar Clark. I mean, it's been so many names.
I need to add
so many
Wright
bodies.
To that list too now.
Dante Wright. Right. Yes, you know, so here we are again and again and again, and we keep asking for help, but no one is showing up. You want the DOJ to be here? What are you guys going to do? We've had these conversations before.
You know, I'm glad you brought the DOJ up. And, you know, there was announced this week that under Merrick Garland that the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice, was opening a pattern and practice investigation where they go into Minneapolis Police Department and they look at the policies, the procedures, you know, the training manuals, and they put physically embed themselves into that police department to determine if there is systemic issues of discrimination and racism that's happening in that department. Did that come was that a piece of good news for the community that the feds are coming to town, that the feds are going to be overlooking? And I should state that this is one of 4 investigations now that have been opened with respect to this police department.
They've done this already. They've done this already. There's been activists that have sat at the table with these same people requesting and suggesting how they could help us. And they denied everything that they put on the table. So today, here we are saying, you're back. And what's your plan? What's your new plan? They don't have a plan. And, although we want them to investigate, but really, what is your plan? What is your motive? Are you really here to help? Are you really here to help? No. We're tired of that. We're tired of having these same conversations and doing the same thing. We're ready for them to take action and stop talking about it. Yeah. So, I think that there's a bigger picture here.
Yeah, obviously the level of distrust, rightfully so, is so great. I think about that press release that the Minneapolis Police Department issued, after George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin, that basically misled the community. And how long it took for them to retract it and to get it right and to come clean with what had really happened to him. So there's so many instances as that are clearly why the level of distrust you've just talked about exists in this community and unfortunately communities around the country. I definitely want to have you come back as it gets closer to that sentencing to again see what the mood of the city is as it relates to the sentencing, and as we get closer to the trial of those other 3 officers. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for your advocacy. And thank you for your prayers, because I know as a pastor, you've been marching and lifting your voice, but I know you've been praying. So, we need a lot of prayer.
Nonstop.
So
thank you, nonstop. I really appreciate being here. So thank you.
Okay, appreciate you too. Wow. Oh, there's so much going on in that community. And unfortunately, it's not just that community. What Pastor Perry just described, that could be any community, St. Louis, Detroit, Chicago. You just pick a city. And what she described, we can find happening in those cities. My next 2 guests are the nation's leading authorities on what we heard Pastor describe, which has been coined as racial battle fatigue. Joining me now is Mary Frances Winter. She's the best-selling author of multiple books, including her latest, Black Fatigue, How Racism Erodes the Mind, Body, and Spirit. She is an award-winning diversity and inclusion expert and the founder and president of Winter's Group. And also joining me is Dr. William Smith. He actually coined the phrase racial battle fatigue and is widely recognized for his groundbreaking research on being Black in white spaces. He is a professor and department chair at the University of Utah. Good morning and welcome to the show, Mary Frances and Dr. Smith.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sure you both heard Pastor Perry and her eloquent expression of what's going on. I'll start with you, Dr. Smith. She gave us the rundown on what's happening in Minneapolis. But like I said, that could be Chicago, it could be St. Louis, it could be Detroit, it could be any city in this country. Help us understand how you think about what she described, particularly in this framework of what you call racial battle fatigue.
I think Pastor Perry actually defined it pretty well and probably isn't an expert in the science, but an expert in the experience of it. So racial battle fatigue is a biopsychological and social condition that we have to deal with. In lay terms, really, it's a systemic, race-related, repetitive stress injury. So it's not a post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not a post-traumatic stress injury. We as Black people have been suffering from micro level, macro level aggressions towards us as Black people. And that has occurred since we have been forced into this country. It has occurred through the Jim Crow laws. It has occurred through the new Jim Crow laws. So all of that toxic energy, all of that toxic stress is coded within the body. Racism is coded as violence. So it's a violent act on our body. And what has happened is we haven't paid enough attention to the body of Black people, the minds of Black people, and the stressful conditions that we live in to really understand how we need to address this racial violence. And that's what racial battle fatigue tries to help us with.
Yeah, you heard the pastor say that the state is spending tons of money bringing in the National Guard and bringing in other law enforcement agencies to, quote unquote, protect the city, but not, any resources going into addressing the collective trauma that individuals that live in that city that have experienced the deaths and the murders at the hands of police that she identified. I want to ask you, Professor Smith, you did a study, 2016 study I was reading about, called the Inner City Blues, after Marvin Gaye's song, where you looked at historically white universities. So this trauma, we're talking about it now in the context of police violence, but racial battle fatigue isn't just about police trauma, right? Or
No.
the trauma we experience from police violence. Help us put it in a larger context.
Well, what it is, it explains these ecological conditions, these white spaces that really are a violent response to the Black presence. And what happens is these kind of microaggressions or micro-level aggressions are exerted as aggressions toward Black people that you do not belong. You do not belong as a teacher. You do not belong as a lawyer. You do not belong in this firm. And so those conditions are highly stressful. And what happens over a course of one's life is Black people have a higher mortality and morbidity rate that's primarily analyzed and discussed as being victims of racial violence or white supremacy.
I'll jump in, Mary Frances. You just wrote a book, pretty much, encapsulating everything the professor just talked about. And I read some of the reviews. Some called it one of the most essential books of 2020 for anyone trying to understand how to analyze and dismantle racism. What led you to write this book? I know this is not your first book.
I was hearing from millennials, folks younger than me. I'm a corporate, person. Corporate, 37 years, I've owned my own business. So I work in large corporations. Going to corporations, Black people were saying, particularly young Black people were saying, we're exhausted. I would look at them and say, you're 30 years old. How are you exhausted already? They give me that side eye, like, we respect you, older baby boomer lady, but we know we're exhausted. And so I thought about it, and I said, and I think my generation, we just kept going. We just kept going. And even though Fannie Lou said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, I don't think that we actually dealt with that fatigue in the way that this generation and the young activists are. They're talking about NAP ministry. They're talking about, rest is resistance, and recognizing that we have to take care of ourselves, and how much well-being, is just so important to be able to continue to be an activist. We talk about being resilient. Resilient just means you bounce back. Resilient doesn't mean that you've dealt with what's underneath that with the system. It's saying bounce back, and you just keep bouncing back, and you just keep bouncing back, and it's pounding. So it's intergenerational. And Dr. Smith, I quote you in my book, and because I recognize that you came up with that term, and you were talking about college students back then. You were the work that I read from you, you were talking about how this impacts college students. I work in the corporate world. After George Floyd, my company was hired to do all of these listening sessions. I could have put just a different label on the report. It could, from healthcare to high tech. I heard the same thing from Black people in corporations. We're exhausted, we're tokenized, we're isolated, we're ignored, we're invisible. All of those terms that were used, from healthcare to high tech and every kind of organization in between. And so, these folks are going to work every day. You spend a lot of time at work, and at work, you are experiencing all of the microaggressions. And in my book, I crossed off the micro, because these are not microaggressions. These are aggressions. Mm-hmm. And it is impacting Black people's health. And what happens in that system? So you're sick, you're not feeling well, you don't go to work. They give you demerits for having a poor attendance. It impacts your performance. You're out the door. Involuntary terminations rates in corporate America for Black people, much higher than white people. So I concentrate on the workplace, and I will tell you that the workplace is in crisis.
So, Dr. Smith, help us understand what Mary Frances is saying, because, somebody may say, well, aren't we in a moment of racial reckoning? Didn't we have the first Black president? Don't we have a Black vice president? Haven't we spent the last 30, 40, 50 years talking about diversity and inclusion, hiring people like Mary Frances to go into these companies and review their policies and come up with ways to make the workplace, more inviting, less hostile to African Americans? How can we still be hearing the complaints that she just articulated if we've been working on this for for so many decades, really?
Well, I think Mrs. Winters would agree that while it's a great effort, and we need to try to change people and environments that they are much more accepting of people from all kind of backgrounds. That work is probably among the most hardest jobs that you can have, because what you are trying to do is change culture. And there's a saying that goes, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you have to change a culture. You can't just have strategy. And white supremacy is very hard to change. And so while we've been talking about it for 30, 40, 50 years, let me remind us that 70 years ago this year, there was a UN document that was drafted by William Patterson. Co-petitioners were W.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and others. It was called We Charge Genocide, the crime of the government against the Negro people. And that was a report that was supposed to go to the UN. They kept Du Bois out from traveling. They called him a foreign agent of the state. They confiscated the documents from Patterson, but they were able to send them to Paris. And so this is something that's been going on for a long time. So racial battle fatigue, when I first did it, was on Black faculty, and then Black students, and then the community. So right now I've done a study on Black women across the country on racial battle fatigue, and it's just not looking good.
Wow.
And you know what happened is when everything happened last year, with George Floyd and everything else that happened in this racial, reckoning, these senior leaders in these corporations, they were surprised. They came out we're shocked that racism still exists. And I'm like, where have you been? And so to your point about the culture, organizations really don't want to change their culture. White supremacy culture is so embedded. They like the status quo. They're willing to pay a lot of money for a job called Chief Diversity Officer. And people who are in those roles are absolutely fatigued and stressed because they don't have the resources, and they just pay lip service to programs and making change. Revolving door syndrome in the corporate world. And so in 1984, there was a headline in the Wall Street Journal, Blacks leave corporate world because they can't get into higher roles. 2019, New York Times, very same headline.
Wow.
And that's 35 years later. We've made no changes. Chapter 3 of my book is Then is Now. You can take any kind of statistic, workplace statistic or health statistic, socioeconomic statistic, and it has not changed. It has not changed because the world, the status quo, people in power don't want it to really change.
Well, Mary Frances, one thing has changed and has gotten worse, which is the life expectancy of Black folks. As a result of the pandemic, our life expectancy has dropped by a year. It used to be 78, point something years, and now we're down to 77. So we lost a year of life. Let me ask you this.
It was only 71 for Black men, just so you know. 71 years life expectancy, even before the pandemic, 71.
Okay, so I'm glad we are talking about this, because that means a lot of African-American men they're already in danger for so many other reasons, but obviously a crisis in terms of Black men. But let me ask you this, Dr. Smith. So many white folks, and you work at a university, and I imagine you work around a lot of white folks who consider themselves super liberal, who say they vote for Democrats and they, eat Sprouts and they, read the New York Times, and they're liberal. And they resist and get very defensive when you use this term racist, you use the term white supremacist. They say, oh, no, that's not me. That's those other people. Mm-hmm. So how do you get folks to have this conversation and do it in a way that's intellectually honest and have some breakthroughs when that even just bringing up the topic puts people back on their heels, makes them super defensive? and causes them in most instances to shut down. I'll give you an example. Been doing the commentary on the Derek Chauvin trial, and I was on air with a lawyer, and he cited some study he had found that said that there was no relationship of race to shootings by police officers, and didn't understand why the whole country, Biden and Harris and everybody, was all up in arms suggesting that George Floyd was killed because he was an African-American man. And, someone checked him on it, and he got, oh my God, I'm not a racist. And, he went on and on about how he wasn't a racist, but he had just made the most tone deaf, let's just call it what it is, ignorant statement ever. But, he wanted to defend himself and say, I'm not racist. So how do you have conversations with folks like that who get so defensive?
Well, that's a great question. And I don't spend a lot of time worrying about what white people think. That's one. I have to worry about my mental health. Now, you're right. I live probably in one of the whitest states in the United States. Fortunately, I have a black wife and some black kids, so that keeps me grounded.
Company, huh?
So that helps me. Love really, and I'm real serious about this. Love and black love is so powerful, and that's what they're trying to destroy now. And between black women and black men in particular. But when has there been a time where they really have loved black people? That has to be one of the questions that we have to answer. We don't have many examples of that. So really, when we go through these situations where they don't want to believe it, that shows that white supremacy is still there, and whiteness is queen and king. So no matter what evidence you present, they will start to have a counter argument to get back to their narrative, because they need to protect whiteness and not feel threatened, because they have stress too. And their stress is having a lawyer that looks like you in their firm. Fortunately, you have your own. Or a pastor who comes and has a powerful message and connects that to the conditions of black people and relate it to passages in the Bible. They don't want to hear that. So one of the things, and let me just say this about microaggressions. Microaggressions is no different than microeconomics, microbiology, whatever. It's a micro level condition. There's a clinical psychologist named Dr. Monica Williams, and she has done excellent research to show that microaggressions are acts of aggression. So we shouldn't get caught up thinking that micro means many, tiny, or insignificant. Just like we don't get caught up thinking about microeconomics or microbiology in that way. If we understand that, and we understand there are acts of aggressions, and those aggressions are violence, then what we have to start to do is to understand racial battle fatigue across the spectrums of disciplines, from business to law, from medicine to sociology to social work, and then have all of these people and religious institutions to start to understand what black people are really going through. So then we can have a plan, because if you can define your pain, then you can discover and develop an approach to deal with it.
Yes. All right. So well said, Professor. Let me ask you this, Mary Frances, last question before I get out. How do we fix this? Simple question. You've been working at it for 37 years. You go into some of the biggest companies in this country. They listen to you. They bring you in. They pay you a lot of money to dissect what's going on in their companies and to give them some solutions. What are the solutions, and how do you get them to take seriously and then implement those solutions?
I think we have a real chance this time, because
racism in this, you're not going to have an answer to racism in that question, but I do want, help us understand what some of the solutions are that you've developed in your own practice.
Yeah, I think we have a real chance this time because so many big corporations came out last year and said we are going to be anti-racist. Prior to last year, you couldn't even use the term racism in the corporate world because you're going to get a lawsuit. So you can't say that. So if you can't name it, you can't address it. Right. You could not say white supremacy culture. Even now, we have companies that hired us to do anti-racism, but they're backing away from even using the language. So I think the first thing is to get the corporate leaders in this country have a lot of power. And so we're working with a lot of corporate leaders and telling them that they have power. And and saying if you're going to be an anti-racist, you have to exercise that power. And we're seeing some of these companies come forward and do so. And you're seeing, we're seeing the politicians telling the corporation, you need to stay out of politics, right? Politics is everywhere. So I think that we have a chance with the corporate world because they are getting a lot of pressure. The pressure before was on hiring, representation, right? Representation is not going to fix what we have because that's just dealing with the branches. It's not dealing with the root. And what we're doing with organizations, we're asking them, who are you investing with? Who are you hiring to do the work? How are you communicating? So we're going really deep into into the organization, the bowels of the organization, to root out things that are happening, and it's very painful. It is very, very painful. In the past, it hasn't happened because when it gets painful, white supremacy culture takes over. The power brokers, I call them, they back away. But I think this time we have a chance. I think we have a chance this time.
Well, I always like to end on a positive note. So, I'm glad you say you see a chance. You see a different opportunity today than, what you saw perhaps 35 years ago. So thank you so much, Mary Frances. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for your really just groundbreaking work in helping us understand, put a name to, like I said, Pastor Perry talked about it so eloquently, and you all have even helped us understand better what Black folks around this country are experiencing, racial battle fatigue, plain and simple. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
All right. Now, my next guest, Yolo Akili Robinson. He's an award-winning mental health advocate, the founder of the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective. He was recently honored by BET for his commitment and work on Black mental health. So we're talking about trauma this morning. We're talking about racial battle fatigue. So we wanted to talk to a mental health expert who has dedicated his career to working on mental health issues in the Black community. Good morning and welcome, Akili.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your BET award. That's quite an accomplishment. You have been at this for a while, working, I know, with the HIV and AIDS community, then working on issues involving violence with Black boys and men, and now looking at the Black community as a whole. What do you make of the trauma that we've been talking about, we've been experiencing? How do we start this healing process?
Yeah, absolutely. So one piece I want to begin with is to name that a big part of the organization that I'm the executive director of, being the Black Emotional Mental Health Collective. The premise of our work is that in order for our Black communities to heal, we can't just rely on psychologists and therapists for our communities to heal. And we have to actually build up the mental health literacy and the healing skills of all members of the community to respond to mental health crises, right? And that's a critical differentiation and demarcation, because we recognize right now, we know that 4% of psychologists, 0.4% of psychologists are Black, right? We know that the dearth and absence of Black clinicians and the problems with access. So a big part of our work is saying, how do we lift up our skills so we can take care of each other better and be able to help defer someone to broader psychological care when needed, right? And so this is a big part, why it's really important right now, is because in this moment of distress, in this moment of trauma, a lot of the folks who are holding the distress for our folks are not necessarily the licensed folks, right? Because most of our folks aren't accessing those folks. They are the pastors, they are the barbers, the stylists, the community activists, the mamas, the big papas. Those are the folks who are holding that. And if those folks have skills and tools and strategies to be able to know how to hold, to listen, to discern, then we know our communities can help support and refine and uplift our wellness. I think it's so important to name that. I think we, as we know, this moment is a continuation of a legacy of harm against Black communities. The police come out of the slave patrols, right? And so our communities have always had strategies and tools to heal. We might need to refine those tools and uplift those tools, but we've always had ways to kind of navigate our distress. And I think the work now for us to do in this moment is to fund and support folks who are doing this critical work on the ground, like the community activists, like the peer support workers, to make sure they have skills and tools to support our folks, because people are reporting higher distress, right? The United United States Census Bureau did a report, and they showed that like clinically depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms had tripled during the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, right? And so we know if they've tripled in this research they're doing, when we look at our communities, we know we're looking at 4 or 5 times potentially, right? And so a big part of the work, I believe, is really, one, building new systems for our communities to heal, because unfortunately the mental health industrial complex is not accessible to a lot of our folks. I think it's great for people to go to therapy, but we know a lot of our people can't afford that, right?
Yeah. So there's a lot of stigma associated with it, and a lot of people just aren't going to go to a therapist.
And I think it's so important that we lift up that like there are other ways we can engage in healing, right? You know, we at our organization, we do a variety of different things, right? So we support a wellness directory full of Black therapists who are doing great work. But we also lift up that there are some people who might go to a yoga teacher. There are some people who might go to a pastor who might have a counseling degree and have some experience. There's some people who might use poetry and writing as a way to help them process and move through things, or art. All of these are viable modalities for our healing. And we need to recognize that every modality has a limitation now. I'm not trying to tell you that, you know, your apple cider vinegar, which might be one strategy, is the same legitimacy as therapy, right? Like, you know, it has different boundaries around what these strategies can help you with. But it is important that we have a wellness tool belt and we support our communities with wellness tool belts so they can actually cultivate village care, not just self-care, but village care where all of our folks can help each other. One story that I often tell is that we have so many of people in our network across the country who talk about that the time in which they were able to get the best kind of mental health support really didn't come out of like going to a therapist. It came to one time they talked to a stylist and they were telling about what they were going through. And the stylist was like, that sounds like depression. That sounds like something. Let me connect you to somebody. I have a girlfriend who's a therapist. She can help you, right? And so we recognize that those folks are critical in helping cultivate wellness for our folks in this moment and in all moments, right? And so I think that's a big part of our approach in our work.
I love that you talk about basically village and collective care. So incredibly important, because you're right. You know, mental health is stigmatized in this country. It's fragmented, difficult to access, and terribly expensive. And as you said, there's a dearth of therapists, of people of color. So even if you want to go to a therapist, finding someone that can relate to your culture, your norms, your traditions might, you know, be very difficult, if not impossible. And we've seen all those studies that, you know, Black folks do better when they're in the care of other Black folks. When you talk about the medical system in particular, help us, Akili. Last question I have for you. This trauma that we're talking about, particularly this police violence on Black folks, it's coming so rapidly. So we're in the midst of the Derek Chauvin trial, and young Mr. Dante Wright is shot in Minneapolis. We learn about young Mr. Adam Toledo in Chicago. That video is released. You know, the verdict is being read this week, and we learn about the young 16-year-old girl in Columbus. Today or yesterday or one of the day this week, there's a 40-year-old African-American man killed in North Carolina by police. So, I mean, it just keeps coming. And I know you talk about this kind of collective healing, but any strategies you have for, you know, anyone, the activists that are on the streets in these cities who are taking to the streets when they hear about these murders, you know, the folks at home that are watching this video camera. As much as a lawyer, I appreciate it because it gets us to trials, it gets us to, you know, convictions of officers. But my God, you know, the videotape of that young girl shot in Columbus was released like within a day. So we are literally watching Black folks get killed on camera. You know, we don't have to watch cops. We don't have to watch any fictional, you know, Chicago PD. We can just watch the news. Help us understand how we deal with the overwhelming, you know, number of incidents that just keep happening.
Well, when I think about care strategies and coping strategies that we can take on, right, I want to uplift some of the things that we already do, right? So what some people call a kitchen table healing or kitchen table therapy, right? We're really building in intentionality to discuss with your children, with your family members, what they're feeling in their bodies, what's coming up for them in this moment. What are the different ways, helping them develop different ways of coping, which might be cultivating awareness or like exercising, whatever that strategy is, like finding out and starting a conversation, but getting tools to help you have that conversation in a way that is supportive and helpful, which is a large part of the work that we do, right? So really building out a community, a wellness system in your community. Who are the folks that you go to express your concern? What is the work that you're doing to engage your body and the ways in which your body is holding the tension and duress? How are you engaging that in your diet? What are those different pieces, right? Those are some of the strategies that we need to be thinking about, and making sure that it's not just on me to do it, but that I'm actually building a wellness system around me of friends and families who are also checking in with me, who are also making sure they're supporting me in taking my medication, make sure they're supporting me. Maybe we need to take a walk. Maybe we need to turn the TV off right now. Maybe we need to check in with the kids and maybe we take them out somewhere. Figuring out strategies for us to ensure that we are doing an ongoing practice of cultivating wellness for ourselves. Long-term solutions, in order for our communities to heal, this is a perspective that we hold. We have to really begin to think about defunding the police and redirecting that income into other strategies for our communities. Whether it's mental health support, so actually mental health centers can be fully funded. Whether it's funding a living wage, accessible housing, these are mental health interventions. And when we know that, like, when we have access to these things, when the police are not killing us, then we know that, like, our mental health will improve. And so that means we need to figure out different ways to reimagine public safety that don't include these systems that are detrimental to our wellness and have been since their inception.
Yeah, Akili, you remind me of something I heard. Someone asked, what can we do to end this? And they said, quite simply, stop killing us. I mean, the solution ain't even all that complicated. Just don't pull out that weapon and shoot and kill, Black and brown folks the way that we're seeing them being, shot and killed and other ways, harmed by police violence. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thank you for sitting down with me this morning. Thank you for giving us some real positive strategies that we can employ. I love the one that says, turn off the TV. So sometimes you just got to tune it all out. You want to be informed, but it gets to be overwhelming at times. So again, thank you so much for those healing strategies. All right, now moving on, my friend is back with us this morning. It's Dr. Omekongo Dibinga. He's a race scholar. He's a professor at American University. He's a friend of the show. And I wanted to have you back, Doc. First of all, good morning and welcome back.
Good morning.
I got to ask you, what's going on in those classrooms? When I witnessed those bystander witnesses, those bystanders who had to come into that Derek Chauvin trial and take the witness stand. We didn't get to see their faces, thank God, but we heard their voices and we know a little about them. We know there was a 9-year-old that said witnessing George Floyd's murder made her sad and mad. We know there was the 17-year-old Miss Frazier that made the video that went viral that exposed this heinous crime. We know there were some other teenagers that were there, including that young kid who told his manager about the $20 counterfeit bill, who said he wished he hadn't ever told the manager. So I'm thinking about your students. You teach college students. How are they processing what we now know is racial battle fatigue, what we know is collective trauma, what we know is this constant barrage of police killing of folks that look like them?
Well, it's very interesting because, and thanks again for having me to have this discussion, because the majority of my students at American University are white, and quite honestly, many of them have not been involved in the fight for racial justice until the videos of like George Floyd and the like came out. And so many of them have expressed frustration with seeing these videos on display all of the time. And I talked to them about it. And even next week for our final classes, we're going to talk about these issues, and I'm going to let them know, like, these are videos I had to stop watching a while ago because of what they were doing to me psychologically. But at the same time, I show them because for my students, they haven't seen so many of these videos in totality. And I'm like, you have to understand that for Black people, we can go on YouTube and make a playlist of Black death, of unarmed Black death. And for y'all to just be seeing this for the first time is problematic. And so they understand that really at the end of the day, they need to start seeing some of their faces in some of these cases. And really it's going to inspire them to get out there and make a difference. But they're just not used to seeing so much Black death on loop. We are. And that's kind of the tension that we're having in the class right now.
Well, do you think them being exposed, Doc, to these videos is causing them to think about their privilege, causing them to think about, white supremacy, white systems that oppress people of color? Is it causing them to really think about that, you think?
For some of them, absolutely. In my class, intercultural communication, we talk about topics that you don't really have to talk about unless you're part of that community. So we're talking about everything from feminism to homophobia to, of course, racism. And in their normal spaces, they are not having these discussions. They do not have to watch these videos. They don't have to talk about these things. And so to be in a space where you got to write about it, you got to process it, they are starting to see things in ways that they've never seen before, like how we can connect what's going on now to something called the Casual Killing of a Slave Act from the 1700s, where slave masters would get off if their enslaved individuals accidentally died while they're being brutalized. So they're seeing that there's a 200+ year trajectory of what we're talking about. And so the goal with the class is to get them to know that this is not new. Black Lives Matter, the phrase was "we shall overcome" in the 60s, and it was something before that. And so once they start to see that, and that I teach them in my class that your silence is compliance. And once they realize they are part of the problem, then I actively challenge them to be part of the solution. And I have students over the years who came in knowing nothing about this who are doing work in prisons right now. So something's working.
No, congratulations. And that's great to hear. You said something that caught my attention. You said they're not having these discussions other than in your class. And I often wonder about that. So you have, majority white, student body at American University. They're in your class. Obviously, they took the class because they have an interest in these issues. They wanted to explore them. But do you know if outside of class, are they having conversations about the Derek Chauvin trial, the guilty on all 3 counts with their white peers, and maybe even going home with their families? Are they talking about it with their mothers and their fathers?
I would say that some are, but generally speaking, I do find myself being skeptical sometimes. Because for some of them to be hit with some of this stuff for the first time, it's really intense for them to go into deeper conversations about it. And sometimes they're just like, I just got to get away from this and get back into my normal life. Other students have talked to me about conversations they've had with their parents, who may be Trump supporters, or who may come from a space that are in a corporate world and don't deal with these types of issues. And they talk about the tensions they have with their parents as well. I mean, I had a student who was a pre-law major who never knew about the 13th Amendment and how it related to prisons. And she was a senior. And so we're having this conversation and she's like, no one ever told me this. So a lot of them are angry. A lot of them are having some conversations outside, but definitely some are just like, I'm going to go back to my comfort zone, which I tell them is their danger zone.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let me just ask you this last question, Doc. The term racism, we've been talking about it a lot. It's on the news. It's in every document that you pick up, every article that you read. But we heard, the earlier guest, Dr. Smith, talk about how uncomfortable, and, Mary Frances too, particularly in her space, corporate space, how uncomfortable using the terms have made people, to the point where she said, now some of these corporations are backing off on those terms. What about students? These are the young folks that we're hoping are going to change the world, have a different world view, and really get us to that point of talking about realistically dismantling some of these systems. I don't know if I have much hope for, anybody over 30, but I'm trying to have a lot of faith in these young people. So, what happens in the classroom when you start talking about race and white supremacy? Does it make the students uncomfortable? Do they feel like, this isn't me? Do they get defensive?
Well, first of all, I have so much respect for what Mary Frances Winter is doing and has done. I do a lot of this work in corporate spaces, and she's just a legend. So it's just amazing to see her with you tonight. And
I always got the bomb guest, Doc. Now
I know. I should have known better. Right? But what I tell my students on the first day of class is, I don't care what you think. I care about how you think. So this is not the class where you're going to get penalized for not knowing what racism is or systemic racism is. This is the class where you're going to learn what it is, so you can be part of the conversation. When people bring this stuff up around to you about racism versus a racist idea versus prejudice, you can know what people are talking about. Some of these schools that I speak at across the country, they're graduating kids who can speak about climate change but can't talk about Black Lives Matter. And so in my classroom, the kids are not uncomfortable because they have been hungering for an opportunity to learn about this stuff in a space where they're not going to feel like they're condemned or be called part of the problem. Now, I tell them they're part of the problem if they're not going to be part of the solution, for sure. But they want to learn how to have this language, the vocabulary, and have this dialogue. So I'm very optimistic about the future when I see these students every semester. They want to learn.
Well, that's a good place to end it on. I'm encouraged now. I'm re-energized and to know that, young students in your class and the young people you see across this country are thirsting, and unfortunately you just, said something really profound, which is you got a senior who didn't know about the 13th Amendment. So, begs the question, what are we teaching kids? How did she get through high school and 4 years at a prestigious university, and no one ever, bothered to teach her about the 13th Amendment? That's quite shocking. It's sad. It's compulsive. It just tells us how much work we have to do. So thank you for being a bright light. Thank you for educating these students and giving them a safe space where they can explore these issues, learn about them, and hopefully, as you said, become a part, not of the problem, but a part of the solution. Always good to see you, Doc. And, you're always dropping knowledge. So always appreciate that as well. Take care. We'll be talking to you soon.
Thank you.
All right. I want to thank all of my guests this morning. Whenever I have this conversation about race, it makes me both happy because we're having it, and I know it's a needed conversation, but it also makes me sad. It makes me sad because in some ways we're having the same conversations, and you heard Mary Frances say that we've been having not for 1 decade or 2 decades or even 3 decades, but for decades upon decades. And as she said, not much has changed. That's quite disheartening. But if we're going to move forward, if we're going to see any change, the change that Dr. Dibinga talked about, we've got to keep having these uncomfortable conversations, and everybody's got to get uncomfortable and be, comfortable with being uncomfortable, because otherwise we won't have the conversations. We shut down, we get defensive, we become strident in our positions, and we just stand still. We just come to a standstill, and that's not progress. Just some words to live by before we get out. You guys have heard me quote one of the nation's or, iconic writers, poets, intellectual thinkers, great big brains, James Baldwin. I love James Baldwin. I love, his work. I love his quotes. And he has said famously, to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. See, I consider myself relatively conscious. And on Tuesday, when the verdict was read in the Derek Chauvin trial, I realized I had been in a state of rage for the last 11 months. Rage because I watched the family of Emmett Till stand in support and solidarity with the family of George Floyd as they awaited the jury's decision. Rage because that visual offered only the merest glimpse of the history of racist violence that stretches back to the founding of this country and long before. Rage because in that moment, I thought about the young people, about young Emmett Till and young Trayvon Martin, Aiyana Stanley Jones and Anton Rose, and about the young people who had the bravery to bear witness on the stand in the trial of Derek Chauvin and speak about the horror that made them victims too. Rage because I thought of the young people who've been brave enough to stand up in their schools and in the streets, and the strength it takes as descendants, heirs of this long, painful history. Rage because I thought about my own children. Rage because the trial of Derek Chauvin was about accountability, not justice. Accountability won't bring back George Floyd or the other victims of systemic and structural racism or the approximately 3 people killed every day by police in this country. Rage because justice can't exist until we've dismantled and rebuilt those systems. Today, I'm looking for hope. Hope that the world will be strong enough to stand up for our children and stand up for a future where justice is true. I'm certain that that's what James Baldwin hoped for too. I'm out, y'all. Don't forget to wear your mask. Be safe out there. And remember, we are all in this together.